It's good to see everyone again this year, and I'm glad that, like Apostle Kelly said, that everybody here has been able to get here and be a part of the conference. I'm going to have a PowerPoint. If you can get that ready for me, that would be wonderful. Last year, actually in 2019, I began to work on something really out of my own curiosity, and that was to look at movements across the spectrum of society. And when I began to study these movements, I decided that I was going to try to make this as extra biblical as possible, meaning that I was going to try to stay away from using biblical language and just using the Bible as the only source and the foundation of what I was wanting to study. And so I began to look at various movements throughout history in the various spectrums of society. For instance, I did a lot of study on the Bolshevik Revolution, which was the Russian Marxist Revolution. I just thought that was fascinating. And then I began to look at other Marxist revolutions in China and Cambodia, in Central America, because there was something there, and this started back about 2017, there was something there that I felt like I needed to wrap my brain around. Then I began to look at other types of movements, which included religious movements. In the United States, we've had what was called the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. And I wanted to try to see if there were common elements across that spectrum. I looked at the temperance movement, for instance, in the beginning of the 20th century, which added an amendment to the United States Constitution that banned alcohol and the sale of alcohol across the country. I mean, that was a major, whether or not, the results of that is what they wanted, it was still a major movement. The women's suffrage movement that gave women the right to vote in the United States. And the reason I was doing this is because of a lot of conversation that Apostle Kelly and I were having about ICAL being a movement. And so I really wanted to try to wrap my brain around exactly what is a movement and where does a movement start. And so as I began to formulate and read and do my research and just read these various books and try to work through my mind what was a common thread between all of these different movements, whether they're religious movements, political movements, social movements like the American Civil Rights Movement, for instance, like what was the common thread across the spectrum of all these movements. And that's where this document came from that you have in front of you. And I'm not going to read the document, but I am going to just basically go through this graphic on the screen. One of the questions even before we began that I think is an important question is, can you manufacture a movement? And if you can, is it ethical? And that's an important question. And I think that if we try to manufacture a movement that isn't happening, then it actually hurts our cause. Because we're trying to convince everyone that something's happening when in fact it's not. But yet I do believe that structure is important. Like when I read the Bible in Acts chapter 2, we know that Acts chapter 2, what happened there, the Holy Spirit was poured out. But Acts chapter 1 precedes Acts chapter 2. And I don't hold the opinion that the apostles of the Lamb were out of the will of God whenever they did what they did by putting Matthias in the place of Judas. I don't adhere to that. Luke wrote that document 30 years afterwards. I don't think he would have included that had it been the wrong move. And so what does that mean? It means that there was some structure before the outpouring. And so the way that I kind of see movements happening is that there seems to be a wind blowing somewhere, and if we can create the sails to get up in that wind, that current is going to take us somewhere. But you still have to have that structure. You know what I'm saying? We just can't say, well, God's going to pour out His Spirit, and then we do nothing about it. It seemed the apostles did something about it. And when they created that structure in Acts chapter 1, it's certainly true that those structures have to be modified as time goes on. And those structures have to grow. And we know this because Jesus talked about the wineskin. And we know that wineskins have to be modified and adjusted. And sometimes what holds us back is not the wind. It's that we have not structured for the next level. And so those structures have to be rethought and examined constantly, by the way, constantly. If you're existing on the same structures in your church or your ministry that you were using in the 1990s, it's old. And what's tragic is we don't even know it at times. And so when I looked at movements, it was like, okay, did the movement start and people respond, or did people create an environment in which that movement was able to take them forward? And I think that while simultaneously both are true, I do believe that there are things that we can do, especially in ICAL, and if you're responsible for perhaps an apostolic coalition in a city, or if you're responsible for an apostolic coalition in a nation. And I think that if we want to transition from organization into movement, there are some things that are common across the spectrum of all the movements that I studied. So this is where I'm at today. It's not like I think that this is it, the finished product. There is no finished product. It's just an ongoing examination. But I think that movements begin, first of all, with outside pressure. I don't think movements start from the inside out. I believe that movements start from the outside in. And what I've called this is creative pressure. Now, one of the things that I tried to do when I was formulating these in my mind, and actually what was interesting is it was at ICAL in 2019 that I actually kind of what I would say put this together as a capstone. And then I had all of 2020 to watch it happen. And 2020 was fascinating for me, like the BLM movement, and then you had the vaccine, and then you have an anti-vax movement, and then you got the Trump political movement. It was fascinating. And so I'm watching all of that happen and then looking at this document to find the flaws. And as best as I can do, this is where it seems to be for me today, is that movements begin with outside creative pressure. And that pressure has to be something that is posing some existential threat to people. Okay? It's not just enough for us as ministers to say, well, that outside pressure is how bad the world is. And I call that, in our vernacular where I come from, the ain't it awful testimony. You know, ain't it awful? Ain't it awful what's happening? And you can't just identify a creative pressure only by ain't it awful in the sense of some kind of disgust mechanism that people have. This has to be a real life pressure that people literally feel. Now, they may not identify it. They may not even realize that they're under pressure. Now, if I could go back to Trump for a minute, I think the Trump team did an incredible job at identifying Americans that were under pressure, that no one else even knew they were under pressure. I'm not even sure the people who were identified as being under pressure knew that they themselves were under pressure, but somehow they were able to identify an outside pressure that was pressing a certain group of people. Now, I have not used the word oppressor because I want to stay away from familiar language. So I just call this creative pressure. And again, the document that I gave you goes into the detail. This is just an overview. Now, the people that actually are affected by this are called the pressed. And what happens with people who are under pressure, they become homogenized in identifiable groups. And Seth Godin in his book Tribes, I know many of you read that book, identified these as tribes. These were people who linked together sociologically because of a shared common struggle. And this is how human beings congeal. We don't congeal according to our strengths. We congeal according to our mutual weaknesses. And this is why my wife can talk about breast cancer in the first person, and then instantly, like every woman that has had a bad report from a mammogram suddenly is in the tribe. It's amazing, because this is how human beings, this is how we unify, because we're wired for social organizations, and that's because we share common threats. And so you have to identify the pressed. The next thing that happens, I believe, is when thought brokers are introduced into this process. Now, thought brokers are those people who are able to look at the pressure and name it. They identify the pressure and they name it. Now, thought brokers are often in our culture those in the media, because they are the ones that kind of have the position where they're watching things happen. But preachers, ministers are also thought brokers. And if you were going to take advantage of a movement and lift the sails to move us forward, then there has to be some thought put into what are the existential pressures that are creative in nature, like carbon becomes a diamond under pressure. And so those pressures are real and they're identifiable. The thought brokers identify the pressure, and the thought brokers identify and name the pressed. Who are the people that are most negatively impacted by this pressure? Now, after the press, those that, and I didn't use the word oppressed because I didn't want to use familiar language. What I believe is next is the identification of what I've called the loss-gain continuum. Now, this is an important point. The loss-gain continuum is the articulation of what people have lost or they're in danger of losing because of the outside creative pressure. Simultaneously, there has to be a statement of what is to be gained by joining and affiliating with this group of people called the pressed. Now, again, I want to go back to the Trump campaign. And regardless of your opinion towards Trump, there's just certain brilliant things that they did over the course of 2016. You know, when I noticed that something was happening is in 2016 when I was in Ireland on public transit, and these Irish teenagers got on the bus and they all had MAGA hats on. These are Irish teenagers. Now, think about what Trump's slogan was. MAGA. Make America Great Again. And what's amazing about that statement is there's a loss-gain continuum summed up in the fewest words possible. Make America great. That's what we have to gain. The word again, the single word again on the back part of that phrase insinuates that something was lost. The loss, make America great again, is the insinuation that we once were great, but we're not great now because we've lost our greatness. And we may not even consciously understand why these certain things appeal to us. But somebody thought that phrase out. Make no mistake, it wasn't by accident. That the loss-gain continuum is the statement of what we've lost or we're in danger of losing. Simultaneously, the gain that we have in involving ourselves in this movement that's formulating. That is the skill and the job of the thought broker. Now we add to the thought broker communicators. These are people who can communicate the message. The thought broker and the communicator may be the same person. For instance, Moses. Moses was a thought broker, and Moses was also a communicator, and he led a movement. And how did he lead the movement? Because he had a loss-gain continuum. He had a phrase, let my people go, and he identified the pressed as my people, and the outside creative pressure was, of course, the slavery that was evoked upon them by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Then come the connectors. I know I'm going really quick. That's why I gave you that document. The connectors are those people who have the ability to bring the right people together at the right time. Now, if you're looking for a biblical example, Barnabas is the guy. Barnabas brought people together at the right place at the right time. And in the book Tipping Point that Malcolm Gladwell wrote, he writes extensively about connectors and how important they are to various movements. And that was one of the books I read years ago that I drew from. Next are the organizers. And the organizers are those people who are the administrators. And there are organizers on the strategic level, and then there's organizers on the tactical level, which we would call community organizers. For instance, in Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals, I read that a few years ago. It's part of the research. And in his estimation, it's those local boots on the ground organizers that were able to go to the press, identify the creative pressure, and organize on a local level that were responsible for the American Civil Rights movement. And so the organizers, now if you look at that list, you can put the fivefold template over that list, can't you? I mean, if you wanted to use the biblical language, and what I enjoyed doing was making this extra biblical, and then once I formulated it, I went back to Scripture and laid the Scripture over it like a template. It's like, wow, okay, this seems to work. That you can see apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. I just didn't want to use that language because that's way too easy for us. Okay, I wanted to challenge us to think a little bit differently about this. Now, here is where the movement is made or broken, and that is at the place of conflict and pushback. Because here is where people are given the choice. Is this movement worth joining? And make no mistake, a movement is going to cost you something. And this is like the frustration we feel when we feel like there's revival in our churches, but our people are not ready for it. Or we feel like that there's some movement and we can see it clearly, but people aren't ready. You know, Moses probably felt like that a few days into the wilderness journey. But the place of conflict and pushback, that will determine the size and scope of any movement. And it's basically this: are people prepared and willing to pay the price? Okay, in Saul Alinsky's book, which you may or may not have a good opinion about him or bad opinion, it doesn't matter. It is what it is. It's historical. But he would talk about how they would organize people to do a small little protest. And those small protests, like sitting in an all-white diner, that was calculated to just see how far we can press and how far we can push. And what that does is it tests the willingness of the people to engage in a price-paying demonstration to see how far people are willing to go. And that will shape the size and scope of the movement. And then finally, you can't get away from this, the timing. Like that to me is the final, most elusive piece. That is the kairos moment, right? It's the timing. It's like Moses had 40 years in the desert, and he wasn't ready, even though he thought he was 40 years previously when he killed the Egyptian guard. But he was not ready, and the timing of these things is like where our intercessors and where our prophetic people have to be able to help us to know that proper timing. But often you don't know the timing unless you're willing to press back a little bit and push back a little bit. So that's it. It's in greater detail in this booklet, and hopefully you can use this as something that might be useful for you if you feel like that you need to construct some wineskins for a movement.